Hi, everyone, and welcome to this COVID-19 update. Manfred Green, Director of University of Haifa's International Master's Program in Public Health and Global Health Leadership, hosted, of course, by the American Society of the University of Haifa. Dr. Green, delighted to have you back with us.
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Great.
So, a lot to get through today. Between the current state of vaccinations around the world, child inoculations, and newly reported information surrounding the Wuhan medical records, of course. So first off, with over 80% of adults in Israel and over 60% in the US now vaccinated, many people are beginning to wonder how long that protection will last. Do we know anything more about this?
Well, it's like what we say, predicting the future is always difficult, but basically it's a vaccine that's given very good immune response. We also know that you develop a memory response, not only in the so-called the B cell and the antibodies, but also in the T cells. So we think that it could last, some say, for a very long time. There are some who argue that a booster needs to be given, but it does seem to be holding up well. So I would say that we can be cautiously optimistic that it'll give good immunity for a fairly long period of time. But again, you know, we in the situation where we'll know much more in 6 months' time, basically,
Right.
when we can actually check. You know, we can actually check the immunity at that time.
Right. Makes sense, and we'll delve into that a little bit more as we progress into this webinar.
Right.
The next thing I want to ask you is Israel actually kicked off its campaign for children aged 12 to 15 to be vaccinated on Sunday, which has already been approved, I should mention, in the US, the UK, Canada, and the EU. With Israel vaccinating such a high proportion of adults, however, it has all but eliminated cases in children. So do we actually need to vaccinate children? And what are the benefits of vaccinating an age group which has been significantly less impacted by the virus?
I think, you know, this question has arisen and it's discussed in the committees and in the public forum. I think that, you know, it's one of the interesting factors of this pandemic and also the vaccine. It's almost repetitive of people, you know, querying the safety of vaccines, because if there's no question of safety, then clearly it's not really a major issue. You can say, well, it can't do any harm, so why not use it? So let's just start quickly with the safety issue, and then we can go on to the issue of how important it is. The vaccine has now got a very good record. It's been used very widely. And generally speaking, we have a pretty good understanding, I would say a very good understanding of how the vaccine works. They're different vaccines, of course, so each one has a slightly different mechanism. And it's producing immunity. And, you know, as we always comment, we're exposed to antigens, to foreign bodies all the time, and our bodies react and so on. So now that we've vaccinated the adults, we come to the children, and if you think about it, most of the vaccines that we use are given to children. That's a policy, you vaccinate children, and people seem to feel comfortable about that, I hope, and I would think that that's the right thing to do. I mean, there's good reason to believe that these vaccines that we use routinely are not only very safe, but they produce very good protection, and we've almost eliminated diseases like measles and polio and rubella, and reduced very dramatically all the others, and obviously diphtheria, tetanus, all those. So now there's this question of why people are concerned about giving this vaccine to children. And often the attitude is, or the answer is, that we don't have enough experience. Well, actually, we have quite a lot of experience now with adults and so on. But if you ask about experience with children, we'll only have experience with children if we give it to children. There's no other way to get back experience. So you base it on the biology of the vaccine, and you base it on the results that you've seen in adults. So it doesn't seem to be any major issue with most of the vaccines. I say most because I can't tell you that I know all of the vaccines, but the ones that I'm familiar with, the more common ones, and they seem to be very safe. There are some issues now with myocarditis in the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna, the mRNA vaccine, and we are investigating it. And it's not something that we should say is trivial, but it's most of the cases are actually very mild. So they're hospitalized just for observation, but they get better quickly and there's no real problem. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be investigated thoroughly, and we need to go into this. But at the moment, it seems, but that's not a real, if you compare it with the disease, and the disease is still around, we're not going to actually get rid of that. And I say get rid of it. People say we'll never get rid of it, but we won't be able to really control it unless the children are vaccinated. I mean, we don't have a situation where we've managed to get a disease under control where children are not vaccinated. So that needs to be the next step. I think that we just have to phase it in gradually and monitor it and make sure it's done. But I don't see it as an issue. Those who will tell me, and I'll make this just the last kind of statement, I've heard people say, let the kids get the disease and then they'll get immunity. Well, you know, I think that the people who say that are not really familiar with the data. It's true that almost all the kids have mild disease, but there are some who have severe disease. There are some who have died. And there are some who have long-term effects. So it's not a trivial thing to say, you know, this is a disease that doesn't do anything. It does. So that's really, I think, where we are at the moment.
Right. Right now, I'm going to ask a question that's actually come through live as we're speaking, and I'll take this moment to also encourage others that are watching live to please, you know, offer any questions that you might want to ask, and we're happy to ask them on these webinars. So, Dr. Green, the question that came through is actually about the efficacy when taking pain relievers before and after the vaccine, and whether that impacts the efficacy itself.
Right. Most of the work done on that, and there's been some work, has not indicated that it would make any impact on the efficacy of the vaccine. It's not generally recommended, although some people I know might think that they should do that in order to reduce pain and fever. And there's been some suggestion that that should be given to children to avoid the pain and fever. Pain is actually minimal anyway. Or there's some pain in the arm later, but the injection itself is pretty, you know, without pain or very little. The fever afterwards can occur, and that occurs in a certain percentage, and the same medications usually that are used for pain are often, you know, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are usually the ones that are used, and they also reduce fever. So I would say that there shouldn't be any concern. I wouldn't recommend it because I don't think there's any need to use it routinely. If in fact you do have fever or pain after the vaccine, then certainly you can use that to relieve discomfort. And that should have no impact on the efficacy of the vaccine.
Interesting. So with a number of COVID-19 vaccines in circulation now, will some vaccines last longer than others? And will people be able to switch between vaccine brands when getting a booster?
Yeah, it's very likely that gradually we'll start to see which vaccines have been more effective for a longer period of time and so on. And there's going to be a certain amount of selection, and some of them may well drop out of the market because there are others that are more effective and with less side effects and so on. So we need to watch that. There is really no problem about getting a vaccine from another company or another type. If you started with one, there could be some differences in the response, but that's just because, you know, you may start with one that has a lower response rate or lower immunogenicity, in other words, less impact on producing antibodies, and take one that has a greater effect, and that may even be better. In fact, it might even combine to be better. But there's really biologically no reason to avoid having them. You know, if you think about it, we give the vaccine to prevent the disease. And right. To prevent the disease means that when you get into contact with the virus, your antibodies will actually neutralize it. So why should we be concerned about getting exposed to some other form of the virus, so as to speak, whether inactivated from another vaccine or the viral proteins, shall we say. So there should be no problem with that at all.
Great. Great. And this is actually a very interesting question that we had sent in as well. So with regards to vaccination life cycles, why is it that we require a flu vaccine every year, but 2 measles shots during childhood can protect us for life?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. The flu vaccine that's currently used is an inactivated vaccine, which means it's a killed virus. And there are killed virus vaccines that give you very long-term protection, like polio and hepatitis A. But the flu one doesn't seem to give very long-term protection. It's not sufficiently what we call antigenic, producing antibodies, but it's the best we have. There is a live flu virus vaccine and intranasal and so on. And we need to follow that up to see whether that gives you longer protection. The other issue with influenza is because it's an RNA virus, part of the family, and particularly what we call a promiscuous virus, it combines with other flu viruses, creates mutations fairly frequently. So the virus does change. So we need to alter we need to alter the vaccine. For measles, that's a live virus vaccine. It's what we call an attenuated live virus vaccine. In other words, it's a weakened form of the virus. It's basically passage, hundreds of times or whatever, until it loses some of its virulence in order to cause disease. So you're actually, in a certain sense, you're actually exposing the person to the actual virus, to the disease you are. It's just a weakened form. And as a result, your response is generally much better. It's like getting exposed to the disease. Even with measles, though, we do see it's not so much a decline. There are 2 reasons why we give the second vaccine dose. One is a kind of a booster, but the more important one is to make sure that those who didn't respond to the first one will respond to the second one. So it's basically a reinforcing dose more than a booster, but it works as a booster as well. And that's primarily with measles. Although we know with measles that in the long term, some people lose their immunity even after 2 vaccine shots. So we need to keep monitoring that as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Now, before we finish, and I think it'd be remiss of us not to bring it up, newly reported information has revived scrutiny of a COVID-19 lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a possible origin for the coronavirus outbreak, of course. Is this now becoming an increasingly believable theory? And how could this change our understanding and treatment of the virus in any way?
There are several issues associated with it. There's a political issue, which let's say is an issue that we don't need to deal with right now.
Right.
The main issue will be that in laboratories that contain viruses or pathogens that can be harmful, in other words, the more dangerous pathogens, they need very high security in these labs. And we know of cases where, in fact, that security is lapsed, and not just in China, in other parts of the world. The most famous one was the smallpox one, which happened actually in the United Kingdom, where in fact the smallpox virus somehow we believe got out of a lab and actually infected somebody working down below in another office. So that's a very important factor to make sure that biosafety, in other words, the labs that deal with these viruses have high safety. So it can't be excluded that it could be, that sometimes the viruses could escape. Right. The other possibility, obviously, is that there's this. Let's just go on very briefly to that. The most important thing is A, to have the safety, and B, if safety precautions are breached, to notify very quickly internationally, so that the world, basically everywhere, can actually get prepared for any possible spread of the virus. I think the criticism to some extent of China was that some believe that the response or the reporting was slower than it should have been. Right. But we could argue it's happened in other countries. And then the last one, and this is an area of my interest, and that's bioterrorism, is to whether there's somehow a deliberate use of these pathogens. There doesn't. First of all, there's no evidence that the virus we have is any different from the virus. It's not an genetically engineered virus from all evidence. The only other possibility is someone deliberately leaked it, but that is always a theory that you can use and expand. It doesn't seem very likely here, but I think the most likely is its natural origin. The second one is there is always the possibility of an escape from, through lack of safety precautions. The last one of Janadair seems to be way off the possibilities, although we keep checking for that. But there's doesn't seem to be any evidence here really to support that.
Right. And would that, if we were able to determine that it did come out of a lab leak, instead of it, transpiring from a market in Wuhan, would that in any way change our understanding or treatment of the virus, or would that still be very much in line with what we've been doing over the past year?
Yeah, other than the possibility that the response may have been a bit quicker, there's nothing else that would have been done. What should be done, though, as a response is to take a positive view and say, internationally, let's strengthen the safety regulations and make sure that laboratories that contain these pathogens have increased safety measures and increased reporting capability. And that can be done. And I'm sure that the Chinese, just as everybody else, will be very pleased, we hope, to join together and make sure this is done. The last point I'll make, and is the anthrax letters in the US, where we still are not really sure how it seems to have been possibly a deliberate thing, although there doesn't seem to be a motive. So, but it did get out of a lab, according to all the evidence. So again, this is the issue you have with these. But this is true, by the way, for all, shall we say, serious pathogens or dangerous pathogens. It could be tuberculosis or any other. These laboratories have to be very well regulated, very well built. And the countries have to realize now that we have to invest money to make sure that their infrastructure is improved. Otherwise, lack of infrastructure, not, bad filtration, bad sealing, bad whatever you have, will obviously increase the risk that these things can get out. So basically, I would say it seems to be still a natural virus that's spread, and it could happen now, and it can happen again, and probably will happen again somewhere else. And we need to be ready, but we will be ready.
I hope so. Thanks so much, Dr. Green. I'm afraid we're out of time this week. But if you do have any questions we weren't able to address today, please leave them in the comments section of this video or send them into info@asuh.org, and we'll do our best to address them at a later date. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you, Dr. Green.
Thanks, everybody.